At the end of the presentations, we will have a Q&A session, and we take that seriously. For those of us who have been doing a lot of webinars, this is often the most interesting part of the presentation, and so I hope you're thinking about your questions and have them ready for us. And we do ask that you all stay on mute, and I believe we configured it so that, I don't know that you can unmute yourself, but if you could just make sure you're on mute. We've all been on those calls where there's stuff happening in the background, and in advance, if it's my dog, I apologize. So on the next slide, I'll just give an overview of what we're going to cover. And how we got connected with NEA is we were releasing a report on parent, teacher, and student views around data technology and privacy. And I think within a day, they were releasing a report on digital equity, and realized how much overlap there is in terms of our commitment and desire to close the digital divide, but also believing that it can't come at the expense of student privacy. So our goal today is to talk about how you do both of those critical things at the same time. This isn't one or the other. You can and have to do both. So we'll start with digital equity and student privacy concerns as it relates to education practitioners. I have some data to share with you about teacher, parent, and student views towards digital equity and privacy. So for those of you who are data geeks like me, we have some good stuff coming for you. Some recommendations about how you advance digital equity while protecting student privacy, and then we'll get to the fun stuff, which is today. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce my co-hosts. I will start with Justin Thompson, who is a senior policy analyst at the National Education Association. Fun fact about Justin and I is we have similar backgrounds, both from Kentucky, went to the same graduate school, both worked at DQC. So I'm excited to co-host with Justin today, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. We have a great representation of folks from across the country here tonight, and we really appreciate you taking your time out of your schedules to be with us. So we begin tonight by acknowledging that we across the country meet on the traditional lands served by Native peoples. We honor America's first people and all elders past, present, and emerging, and we are called on to learn and share what we learn about the tribal history, culture, and contributions that have been suppressed in telling the story of America. I'm now pleased to introduce Brent McKim to provide some introductory remarks. Brent served as a classroom physics teacher for 15 years and has been the president of the Jefferson County Teachers Association in Louisville, Kentucky since 2001. And he also currently serves as president of the National Council on Urban Education Associations. And thank you to the NCUEA folks on here tonight. So thank you so much for joining us, Brent, and I will let you go from here.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks to everyone joining us tonight, including many of our NCUEA members. This evening, you're going to hear about two important and related topics: digital equity and student privacy. As president of NCUEA, I know these issues are a concern to our educators and, most importantly, our students. As the pandemic forced schools to close across the country, many students were left without access to educational opportunities. Students of color, Native students, rural students, and students from other under-resourced households were disproportionately impacted by the digital divide, making worse already existing inequities. So the NEA commissioned a report in October to dig into the data around this divide and provide some thoughtful solutions to the issue. As schools and educators have had to navigate the complexities of remote learning, student privacy has become an even more pressing concern for students, families, and educators. While everyone's doing their best to navigate this changing educational landscape, obstacles that put the digital rights of students at risk are constantly popping up. The Center for Democracy and Technology's report from October focuses on these views of focuses on the views of those who have the most at stake as it relates to student privacy. Thank you to Justin and Elizabeth for sharing tonight, and I'll go ahead and hand it back to Justin.
Thank you so much, Brent. So hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining. Like Elizabeth said, my name is Justin Thompson, and I am a senior policy analyst here at the National Education Association. And as Brent alluded to, one of the issues that we consistently heard about throughout the pandemic is the digital divide. And you may have heard that referred to as the homework gap. This has been one of the primary issues that the NEA is focused on. And in October, we commissioned this report to analyze state level data about the issue. So tonight, I'm going to spend some time going over some of our key findings of the report and some of our suggested solutions, as well as take a brief look at some of the state level data that the report includes. As educators, we understand that all students deserve a high quality education, safe and welcoming public schools, and the training and tools that they need to thrive. But for too many students, the door to this virtual classroom caused by the pandemic is essentially blocked. The expanding use of technology and the subsequent fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic has made it practically impossible to ignore the nation's digital divide, which has worsened the already existing inequities in communities across the country. These days, access to the internet and learning devices such as laptops or tablets is essential for learning. No matter where students live, they need this access for conducting research, doing homework, and attending class when school buildings are closed. Ensuring equitable access to public education is about making sure that all school-age children have the resources that they need, and that means both broadband internet and computer access so that they can meaningfully participate in remote learning regardless of their situation or their condition. Students and families also rely on having qualified, trained educators and instructional support in place to successfully navigate learning wherever they are. So our research revealed that an estimated 1/4 of all school-age children lived in households without broadband access or a web-enabled device such as a computer or tablet. Meeting the needs of all students and educators is not only going to require short-term solutions, but long-term strategies and additional investment in infrastructure and educator training so that we can reduce and eventually eliminate historical, institutional, and structural barriers to accessing these critical digital learning technologies. So, like Brent said, the NEA commissioned this report back in October, and you can find it at nea.org/digital equity. And I highly encourage you to take a look at that sometime in the near future so that we could detail the digital divide impacting students across the country. The gap in full access to broadband internet and web-enabled devices has always existed. It's always been there, and particularly for Native students, rural students, and students of color. But these effects have been exacerbated by COVID-19. And so in the past, we've been able to speak to this in generalities, but this report allowed us to speak to this with more state and local specificity. So as I mentioned earlier, an estimated 1/4 of all school-age children, and that's students aged 5 through 17, live in households without either broadband access or a web-enabled device, such as a computer or tablet. Native students and students of color are much less likely to have access to full connectivity than white students, but these inequalities systematically track across divisions of race, socioeconomic status, and geography. And this divide also occurs in both urban and rural areas of the country and reflects historical structural biases, ableism, inequalities, and prejudices. So this graph here indicates what percentage of students have full access to the necessary technology and the percentage of students with access to computers, broadband, and internet separately. So while 90% of students in the country have access to a computer, only 77% of students have access to high-speed broadband, resulting in the 75% number that I've mentioned before. And one caveat that I want to throw out there is that when I'm talking about full access, I'm referring to having both a web-enabled computer device or tablet, and that does not include phones and broadband internet access. And you may be looking at the internet number and saying, oh, 94% of school-age children have access to internet. But the FCC defines broadband internet as a minimum of 25 megabits per second download speed and 3 megabits per second upload speed. So if it's slower than that, then it's just classified as internet and not broadband. So as expected, poverty was a key indicator of full access in our study. School-age children in households that are below the federal poverty threshold are much less likely at 53% full access than those above the federal poverty threshold at 79% to have this full access. And as you can see in the bottom graph, the urban-rural divide here was relatively significant as well, with a 14-point difference, as 63% of non-metro students had full access compared to 77% of Metro students. And race and ethnicity is also a factor when it comes to student access to necessary technology. As you can see, white school-age children are at 80% full access compared to Black students at 64% and Latinx students at 66%. And a really alarming statistic is that only 50% of American Indian and Alaska Native children have full access, which is concerning as the pandemic continues to affect the education system. So whenever we're talking about the digital divide or digital access, concerted efforts need to be made to be inclusive of the country's Native students. Parents' educational attainment is also a major factor. As you can see here, the more education that parents have, the more likely their students are to have this full access, ranging from 91% for parents that have advanced degrees all the way down to 48% for students whose parents did not complete high school. And one thing that I am personally very passionate about is that when we talk about the digital divide, we not only is this affecting students, but this is affecting educators. So as you can see here, it's only 84% of teachers have full access here. And if educators don't have the proper access, then even the students in their classes who do have proper access are missing out on those educational opportunities. So just as it's important to get this access in the hands of students, it's also important to get it in the hands of educators. So these next two slides are simply just the states ranked by percentage without full access. I'm not going to sit here and go through state by state, but you may be able to quickly find where your state ranks that you can also see in the report. But one of the things that really stands out to me is that states like Mississippi and Arkansas here have over 40% of students without access. And then if you look at the next slide, this is the rest of the states, and it ranges from the 45% in Mississippi all the way down to only 13% of students in New Hampshire. So again, you can find all this information with a lot of details in the report. So when you do open the report later, hopefully, it may seem overwhelming when you initially open it because it has over 200 pages. But keep in mind that the vast majority of those are simply just appendices. And so after you get past the 15 to 20 page report and past the data sets in Appendix A, which if you're a data nerd like me, you might want to go through. But honestly, the thing that I found the most fun was Appendix B, which is our maps. So as you can tell, these maps show what percentage of students have broadband access in particular areas of the state, and the larger cities here are highlighted. So here I just pulled 3 different examples. So if you look on the left in New Hampshire, which was our #1 state with full access, you can see that everywhere in the state has at least 76% access, but then some of the areas even have over 85%. And then you look at the far right and look at North Dakota. So if you look at North Dakota, everywhere is between 76 and 85%. So they're doing pretty good everywhere, but you can tell there's not really any disparities there. Where if you look at Alabama in the middle, which is where I spent 4 years of my life, there are really vast disparities here. And you can see that in the wealthier suburbs of Birmingham, you see over 85% access to some of the major cities, Huntsville, Tuscaloosa, Montgomery, in that 76 range. But then you look in the Black Belt region where it's white and less than 55%. And you can even see in the dark blue county, it's literally adjacent to another county that has 55%. So just really pointing out the disparities here in Alabama. So I highly recommend you go and check out your own state or the states that you're interested in or the states that you work with, because I think these are really interesting and really important to get into the hands of people. So after the maps, excuse me, after the maps in Appendix B, the next appendix has a 2-page profile for each state. And so these profiles have a ton of information. So it has the number of students in the state, the number of students without full access. It breaks it down by income. It breaks it down by race and ethnicity. It breaks it down by educators that don't have access, renters versus homeowners, parents' education. And so like I think these are super interesting. And if you are doing any sort of advocacy work or you need to get quick information about the digital divide into the hands of decision makers in particular states, I think that these Appendix C state profiles are really interesting. So I definitely recommend you check those out too. So obviously, this is just a little slice of our data and report. Recommend you checking the rest of it out, but obviously many questions still remain regarding how to best close the digital divide in the United States. But it's clear that intentional investment and planning by stakeholders for both in-school and out-of-school digital access during COVID-19 and beyond are necessary. First, we believe that every student should have one-to-one device access that is internet capable at no cost to students and families. Second, we believe that affordable high-speed broadband should be available to all in the United States, akin to a public utility such as electricity or water, regardless of someone's race, zip code, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, family status, employment status, economic background, or geographic location. And third, educators across the nation deserve ongoing support, professional learning opportunities, and digital technology resources to effectively teach remotely in an engaging manner. A few of our other recommendations that you can find in the report and see in more detail include the collection of data on students and educators who needed the technology during the pandemic to ensure that those students and educators' needs are met, ensuring access to digital assistance and technical support after school hours, and importantly, ensuring that Native students, students of color, rural students, students with disabilities, those living in under-resourced households, and educators are prioritized to ensure equitable implementation toward closing the digital divide. So like I said, I hope that sometime soon you're able to take a look at the report in your state and dig deeper into the divide in your area. And so the last thing I have to say before I kick it over to Elizabeth is just the reason that why NEA and CDT are here today and work together on this is that as remote learning continues and will likely continue to be a prominent aspect of education as we move toward the future, is that student privacy is as important as ever. With more devices in the hands of students, the more we need to focus on ensuring that students are protected. So on that end, I am going to kick it over to Elizabeth.
Great. I am going to share my slides. All right, can you all see them? Yes? Okay. All right, the hard part's over. We were able to change controls and share my slides, so that is great. So I want to say, Justin, thank you for all of that data. At the same time, thank you doesn't quite feel like the right word. It's very humbling. And, you know, I think we've probably all seen, or maybe some of the folks on the line have experienced, you know, sitting in parking lots, trying to access free Wi-Fi. And so to pair those stories with data to see how widespread this issue is really puts it into context. So I appreciate you doing that work and sharing that with us. So I'm going to pair what Justin talked about and talk about how we can move with urgency and data and technology will continue to play an important role in educating students and in supporting teachers, but how we also need to do so in a way that respects the privacy rights of students and their families. So I'm gonna maybe zoom out a little bit and talk about some more general findings as it relates to views of teachers, parents, and students toward data technology and privacy, but then end with some of our findings related to the digital divide and privacy. So for our data folks out there, I'll give you a brief background on our research so you have a sense of where the findings are coming from. But before I do that, I'll just say why we did it, which is that, and I guess I didn't share much about my background. I worked in state education agencies for 5 years. Before that, I worked at the Data Quality Campaign. And when I took this role, we, as part of our guidance and our recommendations and our tools, we wanted to make sure that they reflected the views of diverse stakeholders. And one of the groups of stakeholders we really prioritized were parents and students themselves. And what we found is that those perspectives, even though privacy is not new, those of you who are familiar with FERPA, the dreaded F word, it's from 1974. So we've been doing this for decades. And yet parents and teachers and students have not been part of those conversations. And maybe to harken back to what Brent said, you all have the most at stake. So of course you should be part of these conversations. And so we wanted to lift up perspectives that are often underrepresented if they're represented at all. So we embarked on this research last year, and we did a series of polling and focus groups. And so you can see some of the information there. One question I get asked is, which school year is this about? This is about the 2019-20 school year, not the 20 to 21 school year, although we are planning on updating this data to see how some of this has changed with this school year as compared to last year. We just don't have that yet for today. So we did a survey of parents, we did a survey of educators, and then we did focus groups with students. And so what I'm going to share with you reflects those findings. So I'm going to go through each of these, although I'm going to go through some of them more quickly than others. And I thought about for this presentation, should I just focus on what we heard from teachers? But I think understanding the relationship between some of our findings related to teachers and how that compares to parents and students can be helpful. So we're going to talk about all of them, but for Q&A, feel free to dive deep on any of the teacher information that is most interesting to you. So the first thing that we found in our research, and candidly, this was a surprise. If you read the news or you talk to teachers or you talk to parents, you don't always hear the most flattering things about how remote learning has gone. Maybe to put it lightly. But in our survey of both parents and teachers, we found that 3 and 4 do support an increased level of online learning even after the pandemic ends. Now, does that mean that there have been issues with implementation? Definitely not. But I think what our survey suggests is that technology is not going away, and that there may be a role for it to continue in an increased way even after the pandemic. And so what that means is that it's on all of us to make sure that technology is used responsibly. And unfortunately, there are examples of data collection and technology use that is maybe even well-intended, but does not have the desired outcome, or maybe is taking resources away from other things. And so I think the takeaway from this slide is that we are seeing support both from parents and teachers for online learning, but that it needs to be done in a responsible way. And so the next thing that we looked at were how do parents, teachers, and students think about privacy? What do they know? What are they worried about? Again, not really being sure what they would say. What we found is that across those groups, parents, teachers, and students, privacy is generally not a top concern for them. Now, does that mean that it's not important or there isn't work to do? No. What we found is that concerns do increase as they learn more about the risks. So it's not something where these stakeholder groups are informed and know everything and have decided it doesn't matter. But as they learn more and become more familiar with the risk, concern does grow. And then the other factor that is increasing concerns around privacy is the pandemic. 1 in 3 parents and teachers have increased concerns about student privacy as a result of the pandemic. But you can see in the graph there that 6 in 10 parents are concerned about privacy as compared to 4 in 10 teachers. And so the takeaway here is that people are going to come to this issue from very different places. And it's incumbent on schools and policy leaders to meet people where they are. And that's going to be in a different place, even among the groups that we're talking about. So when it comes to parents, what we found is that the majority of parents trust schools with information being collected. So that is good news. But there is some confusion among parents about who is actually responsible. Over half of parents think that they're personally responsible for protecting their students' data or their child's data. And yet, in reality, parents, they have some rights, but that responsibility to protect their children's data generally lies with the school. They have the resources, they have access to the data. So parents may think that they have more control and more responsibility than they actually do. We also found that less than half of parents say that their school has ever discussed with them how it protects student data. And that's important because of what I said before, which is that Parent concerns will grow if, as they learn more about the risks. So who explains this to them is going to be really important. If it's a school or a teacher explaining how they protect data and being proactive, that's going to be received very differently than if it's something that's read about in the media about a data breach, or if it's being passed word of mouth of issues that the school might be having. So it's important to think about who is communicating with parents and how they're receiving that information. And as I said before, parents' concerns do grow as they learn more about the issue. But the graph on the right is intended to show that even though I just generalized parents, that in fact, there are important discrepancies and differences about how parents will come to this issue, even among those groups. So you saw differences along gender, we see differences along income, differences along geography and race and ethnicity. And so in thinking about how you work with parents on this, it's important to acknowledge they're not a monolith. And they will have different needs and concerns. And so if you want to engage them, you're going to have to reflect, tailor your approaches to make sure you're actually engaging everyone. So when it comes to students, again, we did focus groups with them. We heard that over half of teachers had not discussed this issue with them. Over half of surveyed teachers said that they had discussed this issue with students. But when we asked students themselves, they did not recall any of these conversations. And so, but they seemed interested in the topic. It wasn't like, we know about it, we don't need to know anything more. There was some interest there, but that, the communication that's happening from teachers to students is somehow getting lost. Or when they think they're communicating about privacy, that's not how it's being received. And so here, making sure that we think about privacy as an important life skill for students, and that parents and teachers can play a role in developing that within students. It is a priority that we think is important. All right, and so then when it comes to teachers, one of the things that we found we were really interested in is what kind of training or supports are teachers getting around this issue. And what we found is that almost half of teachers have not received any substantive student privacy training. And so some teachers are signing forms, maybe their school makes you sign, but not substantive training. And if they are receiving training, it's generally on legal compliance. It's not about some of the things that we're reading about in the news where there are issues like video conferencing or Zoom bombing. We also have found that 86% of teachers have expanded the technology that they're using. So you can see, this isn't the best recipe of not really training folks on what they need to know about privacy, and yet you're expanding the types of technology that you're using at the same time. And so here we really want to draw attention to how important it is to train educators on student privacy. And for those of you who are educators, I hope you bear with me. I know the last thing you need is another training, but I think it's important that we set people up to be successful. And I think asking folks to use technology that might have privacy or security issues for which you're not aware of, I think is a problem. And so I think it's important to set people up for success, and that means training them on how to use technology responsibly and protect students in the process. So here, we're now going to go a little bit deeper on the digital divide and privacy. So Justin's data laid out what the problem looks like, and I thought that especially the state-by-state breakdown was particularly compelling, in that it looks really different state to state, even within a state. We looked at how have schools responded to the digital divide. And so in terms of the response, we found that the percentage of schools who have provided devices has doubled since the start of the pandemic. And so that is good news in the sense of some of the data that Justin laid out and students needing devices. But as you're providing devices to students and, schools may be monitoring what's happening on those devices, it's also creating more risk around what is being collected about students, what they know about. There are stories about maybe being able to initiate a video conference without the consent or knowledge of a student, and it's not on purpose, but because things may not be configured. So as we're giving out these devices, there are privacy and security risks that are increasing with the exposure and having more students having these devices. We also saw that schools are providing options to provide subsidized internet, but that teachers are far more aware of those things than parents. And I don't think that's like breaking news necessarily, that someone working in the school would know more about an initiative or an outreach effort than parents. But it does mean that, as we talked about before about parent engagement, that making sure you're reaching people is really important. And so I think our takeaway here is that as an organization, and I'll just say as a person, I believe deeply in the need to close the digital divide. I felt that way before Justin's presentation. That only reinforced, I think the need for it. But I also believe that we can't sacrifice privacy in the process, and it can't be an afterthought or something that we give out a bunch of devices or we share a lot of data with internet providers, and then we ask ourselves about how do we keep students safe. That these things actually need to go together, and that you can do both. So the part that we're trying to help with is as you're giving out devices or as you're ensuring that households have broadband, how do you make sure you're not sacrificing privacy as part of that too? And so this is my last finding. So for those of you, get your fingers ready to type us questions, please. We found some bright spots and some places that we saw teachers really shining and maybe knowing more about privacy than some of their peers. And two important dimensions that we saw where they were more aware of student privacy practices and policies. They had received more training. They were talking to students more often, were along two dimensions. We found that if the teacher taught in a school that has a technology plan and that plan addresses privacy, that was really filtering down throughout the building, and those teachers just knew more about it. So even just a school putting together a plan and sharing that with teachers had a pretty significant impact. And then the other place we saw some better privacy practices or more knowledge was among special educators. That when it came to awareness training and discussing this proactively with parents and students, that they were having more of those things. And that happened both in the polling that we did and in our focus groups. We heard that sometimes teachers may go to special educators to even get advice about how to securely store something because they see how careful they treat IEPs and whatnot. And so my takeaway here is that almost like the call is coming from inside the school. Like you have what you need. You have leaders on this and special educators, and they may be able to help you have better policies or learn from how they're protecting student information. And so our takeaway here is that there are promising practices that are happening that could be looked at, scaled, implemented, and that we're not just starting from scratch on these things, but that there really are bright spots and something to be proud of when it comes to privacy. So with that concludes my presentation. Let's see, I'm Central Time Zone, so it's 6:36 where I am, which leaves us 24 minutes for Q&A. So I think what I will do is I'll stop sharing. And we'll look in the chat for questions that you all have.
And while we are waiting on a couple questions come in, I had a couple questions come in to me directly. So I'll go ahead and I'll take a couple of those until we get other ones in the chat. So one of the questions was, what are some of the biggest policymaking obstacles in addressing the digital divide, and what should the new Congress prioritize in crafting its response? So I didn't touch on this in the presentation, but one of the things that the NEA has been really pushing hard for and advocating for is additional E-rate funding from Congress that can be allocated specifically for internet and devices at home. So for those of you that don't know what E-rate is, It is one of 4 universal services programs that's focused on connectivity in schools and libraries. And it was created in 1998, and it provides about $3.9 billion in discounts to ensure that schools and libraries have access to broadband and Wi-Fi. And it has significantly helped close the broadband gap in schools, but this access outside of the school remains an issue. And we believe that the E-rate program is already a successful program, and it works, and that schools know what it is, and it has that infrastructure to be the best vehicle to equitably and quickly disseminate funds to schools and libraries. And we were previously, in terms of what Congress can do, we were previously asking for $12 billion in any sort of stimulus package to go toward E-rate. It was making some headway with the previous Congress, but we're kind of in a standstill right now, kind of seeing if we can get that negotiated in this next bill. So I see it. Do you want to take Jason's question, Elizabeth, and then I can go back to one of mine?
Sure. Thank you for your question, Jason. The answer to your question is yes. I think a number of us, when we saw the pandemic happen and the increased use of technology and the increased risk around privacy, created some trainings. So I'll highlight some that we have put out and that we have coming up, as well as some of our peers. So we have an online training that is about COVID-19 and student privacy that is specifically targeted at what are some of the new issues and risks that need to be addressed as a result of the pandemic. And our goal with that, when I was in a state, I spent time training people in person, and I loved it. But it's hard to do that with everyone. And so we tried to take that experience and then put it in an online training so that all you need to do is send it out to whomever needs to take the training. We have an interactive version that has, interactive quizzes, and you can show completion if that's important. We also have a version on our website where you can just push play and watch it. So you can go to our website and find trainings on COVID-19 and student privacy, and then we also put one together on some of the issues specifically related to schools reopening, whether that's in person, hybrid, or fully remote. And there are unique considerations around that. So we put that into a training format. In addition to us, the Future Privacy Forum has some great trainings that are really targeted toward educators. So I would look at them as well. And another resource is the Privacy and Technical Assistance Center. They have some great resources and some videos. Sometimes a video is worth 1,000 words that can be used to sort of explain why some of these issues matter. So yes, there are resources out there and I guess the good news that I try and remind folks of is that even though the privacy risks have increased, it's not a new issue. So we were all working on this before. And so there are organizations and supports and resources that are out there. And I think it would behoove us to remember, like, we've done this before, right? Like, the issues might be new and we need to tweak what we've done, but we have supports and experience and knowledge that we should really draw on in this moment of global crisis.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. So I'll get my last question that was sent to me earlier, and then I see Miriam had a question as well. So the question was, how can further data-driven research and investigation like the report that you put together help close the digital divide? And so I think really just the more data that we have, the better. And it really, the more specific we have, the more we can really focus on that allocation of resources. Because to us at the NEA, like, equitable implementation and equitable distribution is really important for us, and just making sure that we're really focusing on these groups that, like Native students and students of color and rural students that have been left behind by this digital divide. And then I see a question, what impact do you think the $7 billion broadband section of the recently enacted COVID-19 relief package will have? I'm going to be honest in that I have not had the chance to analyze that yet. So Miriam, I'm going to note your email address and connect with my folks in government relations and have an answer for you on that, because I have not gotten to go over that. So thank you for the question.
Justin, while folks are putting more questions in, can I ask you a question that your presentation made me think about? And it's building on the one about how can data help, but I thought especially with the state profiles, like, have you seen, is there like an example or an innovative use of that information that you've seen, or like suggestions about how like tactically you might use that and the conversation you would have and how it could support what you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the my favorite part of our whole rollout of the report was our president, Becky Pringle, went on a satellite media tour and did interviews all across the country. And one of the people that interviewed her was actually one of her former students, which was really cool. But she was just able, the fact that she could just take these 2 pages and basically she knew what was in the report, but she could take these 2 pages and tell, if she was doing an interview in Pennsylvania, she could go through and tell you everything that you need to know about Pennsylvania in the gap. And I think just taking these huge data sets and putting them into 2 pages for every single state, it's really, because obviously policymakers don't have a whole lot of time to review. They don't have time to review a 200-page report and look at all these data sets. But if you can hand a congressman in Georgia and say, hey, look at this gap in Georgia, like you can see all these disparities, they might be able to get on board a little quicker.
So one question that came in, and it might be for both of us, Justin, but I'll state it and start it, and then you should share your thoughts too. I think it applies to both of us, which is what would we like to investigate in future data-driven research like this? So I think one thing that we're thinking about related to the digital divide and privacy is wanting to look at the impact of giving devices and connecting students and families to and look at its relationship to the kind of monitoring or data sharing or data collection that might be happening. And if devices and if internet connections are happening, if school issued devices are being provided at a disproportionate rate to certain communities, and on those devices, you're more likely to be tracked or surveilled, is there a disproportionate impact on those students? Especially if it's low-income students or students of color, and some of what's collected is maybe used for discipline purposes. We've seen some, kind of crazy stories about what schools have done with some of that data of, suspending a student for something that they may have searched, or not logging in, and so they, are sent to juvenile jail. So in terms of future research, I think we really want to look at the impact of closing the divide, but trying to quantify and make sure that it's not having unintended consequences, that it's actually like working at counter purposes of what we believe in terms of equity, and making sure that all the things that Justin talks about are reality. I think the other thing that we are interested in is looking at how some of the data that I shared changes over time. So we'll be refreshing some of that data to see how people's perspectives evolve. And last year when we did this, the goal was, we wanted to create some baseline information about these different groups of individuals, and quickly realized there was nothing baseline about 2020. It was, a wild year. So we will, be updating our research accordingly, while also acknowledging that there's nothing baseline or normal about what's happening right now. But Justin, in terms of future research, what do you think?
I mean, I really think you hit the nail on the head there, Elizabeth. You pretty much said exactly what I would have said. So, I do see another question from Jason, I think directed towards you.
Just take a minute to read it. Not a minute, a second. Yeah, so Jason's question is about the role of students. I would say, our student research, so unlike teachers and parents, we did focus groups with them. So we have more qualitative data. And as our research vendor that we use is quick to remind me, polling data is directional, it is not statistically significant. So some of the student data that I shared needs that caveat. I think what we heard mostly from students is that this is not something that they think about. And when they do, they think about it in the context of I want to make sure that no one knows my home address so they don't show up and do something kind of scary. Not like, I don't want schools to be tracking what I'm doing on a device and sharing that with a third party. And I don't think that's because they've assessed that concern and have decided it doesn't matter. I think it's mostly an issue of not knowing. So I think to your point or your question, we didn't look at that, and we didn't really find examples of students pushing back much at all, that they generally also trust schools. One thing that we want to do in the coming year is not just do focus groups with students, but polling with them too, so we can try and quantify some of the like anecdotal or directional, it's what they tell me to say, directional information we have about student views toward privacy. But I think it's a really interesting question that would be good to look at. I see Sean Cottrell, who is with PTAC. I didn't know you were on, Sean, so that shout out was genuine. Has put in a link to some of the resources that Department of Education has created. And I can say when I was in states, they're very helpful. And to be able to say that they are also issued on behalf of the agency that is enforcing the law that you're trying to comply with is also very helpful. So shout out to PTAC and all of the great work that they do. So maybe give folks another minute or two to ask questions. And if nothing comes in, Justin, maybe if you want to say anything to close, and I can dismiss us. Oh, here we go. Yeah. I can speak to that from a privacy perspective. So in terms of the ability to advocate for themselves, I think it's, well, let me say, so this is not even directional. This is like, I guess Elizabeth talking. I think one issue we see across the board is well, I guess it's mostly with parents. They don't know their rights. FERP has been around for a long time. Parents have had rights for a long time. Doesn't mean that parents know what they are. And I think that's one issue. And I think, the rights that they do have are not frequently exercised. I also think that the fact that with FERPA, it's the parents who have decision-making authority until the student turns 18, probably doesn't help with that. But I don't think it's an issue of, a legal issue of not having the rights to advocate. I think it's more of a knowledge gap, which is why I think with both parents and with students, we would like to see more proactive training and engagement and, supporting their knowledge with students. There's the advocacy piece, but just like as a life skill, like, what are you signing up for? How many apps do you have on your phone? Like, no one is reading, the scrolling notice and consent. So I think there's an important question around that, but I think the bigger issue is not understanding why it's an issue and not even knowing what rights people right now. Justin, do you have anything to add to that about student perspectives?
I don't think I have anything on that question. But if you're wrapped up with that one, I was going to touch on Duncan's question. So Duncan asked, how underreported or underfocused are digital skills, not just to closing the digital divide, but also for online health in terms of privacy and security? So I'll focus just very quickly on the closing the digital divide aspect. And I think you're right, Duncan, in that it probably is underfocused. And one of the things that the NEA has touched on, anytime we're talking about the digital divide, yes, we're talking about getting devices and getting broadband access to students and educators, but also like making sure that educators have ongoing professional development that's culturally relevant and focused on these digital skills, so that not only are they proficient in these digital skills, but also can pass that on to their students. But I think that's a really good point to point out. So Elizabeth, do you have anything to add in terms of privacy and security?
Yeah, I think we looked at the training that teachers were getting. And so I think in terms of teachers, I touched on this before, that maybe, like, I think schools generally understand that privacy is important, but not taking it to the next level, which is, how do I meaningfully develop my educators' capacity and ability in this area? And so you see a drop off between, like, we sign a form, or we talk about it, to we actually are trying to cover substance. We're trying to make sure you understand what state and federal laws are. But even it really drops off when you look at like the things that are most relevant, which are the things that you need to do to protect students in an online world. So I do think that there's a big gap in the technology that's being used within schools and by teachers, and then their training that they've received on how to use it in a private and secure way. And I guess I'll just say what I said before, which is that, I was in, when I was in states and I would talk to schools or teachers about it, it felt like, oh man, I can't imagine another training. Like, no, thank you. And I guess I would say, I think about it like setting people up for success. And that if you are going to introduce new technologies, especially in, a fast-paced, literally crisis, that you need to also help them understand how to use them responsibly. So I hate to be the person who's saying like, we need more, we need more training, but I think we do. If we're going to use technology the way that we are and respond to what we're hearing from teachers and parents, which is that they want some kind of increased online learning moving forward, that this isn't going away. Those are both great questions. So I'm glad we did it. I'm glad we gave it a minute. So we'll do another minute to see if there are any other good ones out there. All right, Justin, do you want to just offer some closing remarks from NEA's perspective, and I can do the same from CDT?
Sure. So yeah, I just at the NEA, we just want to thank you all so much for taking time out, especially for those on the East and Central where it's after the workday. Appreciate you all coming on. We just want to emphasize how important we believe this issue is and how important this is for our educators and for our students. If you have any questions to me about the report, again, you can find that at nea.org/digital equity. But my email is jthompson@nea.org. Please reach out at any time, and I'm happy to chat with you.
Great. And I'll say thank you, Justin, for being my co-host literally on this webinar. And thank you to all of you. As Justin said, it really does take a special group of people to opt into a webinar, after work on the digital divide and privacy. And so just want to thank you for your time. I guess what I would say in conclusion, I think our perspective is like +1 to the urgency and all of the things that Justin said about how important this is. But let's not forget, protecting students in the process, and that, as we're getting them connected, we have an equally strong obligation to also keep them safe. So with that, thank you again. This webinar was recorded. It'll be up on CDT's website. My email, I think it's easily Googleable, but if not, it's Laird@cdt.org. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Thank you.